If you're learning Norwegian and you want to start speaking as soon as possible, you don't want to wait until you've studied the entire 300-page grammar book. On the other hand, if you make grammar mistakes, then Norwegian speakers might misunderstand you, or at least you might sound extremely weird when you're speaking Norwegian, and you want to avoid that as well. So what to do? In this video, I'd like to introduce a new perspective on grammar. I'm going to categorize it according to a traffic light system to red grammar, yellow grammar, and green grammar, and that will give you a survival guide for the Norwegian grammar. The red grammar items are grammar items that you need to get right in order to speak Norwegian, in order to get off the ground, because if you get them wrong, then you will most likely be misunderstood or at least sound really weird. Fortunately, there are only 9 red grammar items in the Norwegian language, and I'm going to show you all of them in this video. The yellow grammar is the nice to have. If you get it right, perfect. If you don't, it's not a big deal. And the green grammar is more for the aesthetics. So it's nice if you get it right, of course. It's nice if you understand it, so you understand how the Norwegian language functions. But if you make a mistake with it, sometimes Norwegian native speakers might not even notice it. So without further ado, let's get started. So verbs and pronouns are the first item on my list over essential grammar issues in Norwegian. Now, verbs are words that describe what somebody does, like to love, to wait, to hate, to eat, and so on. That's verbs. Pronouns are words that replace people or things, like I, you, he, she, it, and so on. So we have a certain list here in Norwegian. The pronouns are quite easy. It's jeg, du, han, hun, vi, dere, de. And notice the weird pronunciation, especially of the jeg and of the de. So that's a bit irregular here. But from there, it's actually much easier than in English, because in English you have this issue that sometimes the verb changes depending on who is doing something. So I work, but she works, you have to add this s. That's a bit of an issue in English. With some verbs, it's even more complicated, like I am, you are, she is, and so on. But in Norwegian, it's super, super simple. You always have the same ending for every verb, completely regardless of who does something. Also in Norwegian, we don't have a continuous form, so you can't do something like I am working versus I work. It's always I work, you work, and so on. And usually these verb endings have an R here at the end. You can see that. So it's jeg arbeider, du arbeider, han arbeider, and so on. It's always the same. It's super, super simple. One thing is that's a bit weird in Norwegian. We have pronouns for things. So when we're talking about an item like a phone, or here a rundstykke, that's a small bread roll, we would use either den or det. So we don't have just one pronoun like in English where we say it. We have den or det, and the reason is that nouns have a grammatical gender. Now, the grammatical gender is definitely not a red grammar item. If you mess it up, it's not a big issue. But remember that whenever you use en telefon, you would say den, and when you say et rundstykke, you would say det. Meaning, if the gender is masculine or feminine, then you would say den. If it's neutral, you would say det. But again, as I said, this is not essential grammar, so if you mess that up, no big deal. Before we move to the next grammar item, I'd like to invite you to check out my story-based Norwegian course, The Mystery of Niels. If you're ready to put in the hard work of learning Norwegian from scratch all the way up to B2, you want to make the process as pleasant as possible, and you don't want to learn with boring, silly dialogues. Instead, I've prepared a story that is very, very simple at the beginning and gets more and more complicated over time. And of course, I show you the entire grammar, the pronunciation, how to study the vocabulary, learning strategies, all of that in one course. Check it out. There is a link in the description below. But now let's move on to the next red grammar item. Next issue, the difference in pronouns between subjects and objects. Now, you might say that that's also very similar to English, and it is. If I say he loves her or she loves him, that's a difference, right? So you don't say he loves she. So the she becomes her in English. And we do something similar in Norwegian. So all the pronouns that you've just learned before here, like han or hun, they're going to change. when we have an object, meaning when somebody is like, say, the victim of an action that somebody is performing. Now, to be loved is not really, you can be the victim of love, why not? Okay, so you don't say han liker hun, you say han liker henne, and you say hun liker ham. So every pronoun that you've just learned has an object form. So jeg becomes my, du becomes deg, han becomes ham, but we can also say han and not change it at all. Hun becomes henne, den and der, the two object pronouns, the two thing pronouns that you just learned, they remain the same. Vi becomes oss, dere remains the same, and de becomes dem. Now we also have this weird sei, which we can sometimes use for han, hun, and de. And we use it whenever the subject and the object are the same person. Now, how does that work? Well, if you look into the mirror. So he looks into the mirror and he can see himself. And then we would say han ser seg. Whereas when we say han ser ham, then he is looking at a different person. Okay? Very simple difference. That works with many verbs, like for example, I can wash myself. It would just be the same thing. If I say han vasker seg, he would be washing himself, and han vasker ham, he would be washing somebody else. Okay? Pretty simple, that as well. Remember one thing, we have 3 translations for the English you. Because you guys, you always use you for everything. We don't do that in Norwegian. So where are you, Tom? As a subject, hvor du, Tom? But I want to talk to you, Tom. Then we have Tom as an object, and then it changes to jeg vil snakke med deg, Tom. And when I talk to 2 people, like Tom and Betty, where are you, Tom and Betty? I would say dere, hvor dere, Tom og Betty. And if I want to say, I want to talk to you, Tom and Betty, now it becomes an object. But as we've seen in this overview, dere is one of these object pronouns that fortunately doesn't change. So we would also say, jeg vil snakke med dere, Tom og Betty. How to ask questions in Norwegian. It's super simple, especially when we have these yes and no questions, where you can just answer ja or nei. We just put the verb at the first position. Like får jeg en gave også? We don't do things like in English, do you have to, do you want to, are you going to? It's much easier in Norwegian. We simply start the sentence with the verb and that's it. Get I a gift also. That's it. Very simple. A bit more difficult, but still not really difficult, is if we have open questions, meaning a question where you can answer anything, basically. And there we have the question verb at the first position. Like, for example, what? What is that? Hva det? I guess it's still very easy for you. Numbers are important in all languages, and so are they in Norwegian. So these are words, basically it's not really a grammar item, is it? But I put it on the grammar here. So you should learn them by heart because you need them all the time. And if you mess them up, then you come an hour too late or a day too late, or you pay the wrong price, or you go to the wrong room in the hotel. So it's always a bit weird. So just learn them by heart. Null. And then we have en, a, or et, and it depends on whether the thing we're talking about is masculine or feminine or neutral. So I mentioned before that things have genders in Norwegian. We will get back to that issue a bit later, but that's not red grammar. So if you mess it up, don't worry about it. And then we have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We don't pronounce this E here. And then we say 12. So if we wrote it properly in Norwegian, we would actually write it like this, but for historical reason, we write it like that and we say 12. And then we have 13, 14, 15, 16, completely irregular pronunciation. We should actually write it like this, but we don't. 17, also irregular pronunciation. It's written with an E, but we say an Ö, okay? And then it goes on to 18. And you will see that there's a bit of an important difference here between 18 and 80. Then we have 19, 20, and then it gets very simple. We just add whatever comes after it. 21, 22, and so on. Okay, so we do 30, 31, and we would do 32, 33, and so on. 40, 50, 60. Here we say 60, okay, that's a bit weird. So we say 60, but we say 16, just something to learn. 80, 70, 80, 90. And now we can say 100 or we can just say 100. But when we add a number after it, we always put this å. So we say 101, 143. Okay, 200, and then the system continues, and it goes to 1000, 1015, or here something a bit more complicated, 5130. Okay, so numbers are something that you should simply learn by heart. Now, the next item I have on my list are possessive pronouns, owning things and people. How do you say that? This is my son. Well, you're not owning your son, but you get the idea. There are two ways of saying this. You could say min son, and you could say sønnen min. I'm only showing you one of those here because the other one, it's enough if you understand it, you don't need to learn it by heart. The other thing is that things and people have grammatical genders, so we would say min son for your son and min datter for your daughter. We would say mitt hus with a double T. I'm not showing you this here because I would say that's a little bit advanced, it's not red grammar. Okay, so it's min son, din son, hans son, hennes son, like his son, her son, okay? Vår son, and then it's deres son doesn't change whether it's your, like your in the plural, you know the idea. We have a different word here in Norwegian for one person you and several person you. And there's also deres son, like their son. It doesn't change. But maybe you don't want to use a pronoun when something or somebody belongs to you. So then you can do it with the word til. Okay, Susanne's brother is broren til Susanne. And if you have studied a little bit more Norwegian grammar, you would see here that the brother is in the definite form. Now, that's not a big deal. If you get that wrong, it's not red grammar again. But this til, yeah, broren til Susanne. And you can do that with any item, like bilen til Susanne, Susanne's car, or bordet til Susanne. And you can even do it with another person. You can say like my mother's table, okay? The table to my mother. That's how we would do it in Norwegian. Bordet til min mor. Very simple. Next thing on my list is plural. Like how do you say that you have several cups or several doors or several windows? In English, you always add an S, and in Norwegian, you add an er ending. So to, tre, mange kopper, dører, vinduer. There's two exceptions to that. One is when something already ends in an e, then we don't add another e. So you can see the difference here. We have kopp, and then we can say kopper, or we have dør, and then we say dører. But here we have nisse, so we don't add another e, we just add this r here, to nisser. And the short neutral nouns like hus, they don't get an ending at all in the plural. We would just say to hus. But yeah, if you get that wrong, then that's also, I would say, yellow grammar and not red grammar. The most important thing to remember is this R ending, which is the basic plural ending. So you can see we like putting R at the end of anything in Norwegian. We do it with the verbs in the present tense, and we also do it with the nouns in the plural. You want to be able to say what you did yesterday, and for that you have to learn the past tense. There are 3 past tense forms in Norwegian, and for now it's absolutely sufficient to only learn one. It is called preteritum. So as with the present tense, there's just one single form per verb. And unfortunately, when the verb is irregular, you have to learn it. So here you have the irregular verb å gå, to go. And the past tense is jeg gikk. Okay, we write it with a J and we say it like a Y. Jeg gikk, but it's always the same in all persons. Du gikk, hun gikk, vi gikk, dere gikk, de gikk. It's always gikk. So you have to learn one form per verb, but unfortunately there are many irregular verbs in Norwegian and you have to learn them. If you want to have a list, all what I'm saying here on this video, you can download it as a PDF. There's a link below this video that will show you where to download it. And there you have a list of the most important irregular verbs also. Now, when the verb is regular, then it's a little bit easier because it will fall into one of these 4 groups, and it's a little bit predictable how to get into these groups. So the 4 groups are either this et ending, and you have verbs like våkne, which would become jeg våknet, or arbeide, which would become jeg arbeidet. And then you have a few verbs that come into the te ending, like spise, jeg spiste. In some verbs, this becomes a little bit softer. Instead of levte, you would say levde with a D. And the short verbs, the one that just have like one vowel, like u or a, e, and so on, and really just one syllable, they get a double D. Jeg bodde. The idea is that whenever you have a double consonant, then something gets short in Norwegian. So we would say å bo, and then we would say bodde with a short u. Okay, now how do you know? You can't be 100% sure which verb belongs to which group, but there are a few rules. And usually it's best to start off with this one, because that's the most common group that is for verbs that have just one single consonant here, because it's very easy to say spiste. Of course, I could say spiset, but yeah, spiste is easy to pronounce. Whereas here, if you imagine putting this ending to that verb, it would not work. How do you want to say våknte? It doesn't work, okay? So it's very natural here to use this form våknet. And the same with arbeide. How do you want to say arbeidte? It's like it doesn't really work, so you say arbeidet, okay? So all these verbs that have a double consonant here, or that have a D here, it would be super difficult to pronounce them with this ending, so you use that ending. And this is really something that happens rarely, the D. It happens with verbs that have a V here, or the ones that only have several vowels, like the ones that end in eie, for example. It's really rare, but you can imagine that it's a bit easier to pronounce jeg levde instead of jeg levte. That makes it a bit softer, so it's easier to pronounce. It's not so difficult to remember. And here, as I said before, the long vowels, they always get this double D ending. So past tense is not that difficult. The only pain in the ass is the irregular verbs that unfortunately you will have to learn. So here's my last red grammar item, and that's comparing. Like when you want to say that something is bigger or smaller or just as big, or it's the biggest. How do you do that in Norwegian? Well, you need a form for that to say bigger or colder or more modern or something like that. And it works a bit similar as in English. Most adjectives like that you call these words, right? Cold, big, short, and so on. They just get an ere ending. I Trondheim det kaldere enn I Oslo. It's colder than in Oslo. Okay, quite easy. Kaldere enn. Don't forget this N. It's colder than in Norwegian. Kaldere enn. Some adjectives, especially the long adjectives and the Latin adjectives, meaning the international adjectives, they do it a bit like in English, like more and most. So they would get this mer moderne. Min leilighet mer moderne enn din leilighet. And how do you do it with the superlative, like coldest, most modern? Well, also very simple. You just add est for the adjectives that have this ere ending in the comparative. And instead of mer moderne, you would say mest moderne for the adjectives that do it with mer. Okay, so you can see it's really, really simple. The only thing here is, unfortunately, you also have a few adjectives that are irregular. Like, for example, få, you would say færre in the comparative, and færrest, or bra, bedre, best, just like with god, bedre, best, gammel, eldre, eldst, and so on. Yeah, here these two are not so irregular. You can see they only change the vowel here. So unfortunately, these you will have to learn by heart also. So now you know all the 9 red grammar items, and you have no more excuse not to speak Norwegian. Now you might ask yourself, what to do about the yellow and green grammar items? Should I just ignore them? My answer is definitely not. On the contrary, you might even have to study them from the beginning. And I'll show you an example. Take grammatical genders of nouns. In Norwegian, every noun has a gender and there is no sense in the distribution. Doors are feminine, cups are masculine, windows are neutral. That's just the way it is. If you make a mistake with that, and you misgender a window or a door or a table or the heating, it's not a big deal. People will still understand what you want to say. They might even overhear the issue. But you don't want to misgender all nouns. So of course, in the long run, you want to get it right, at least say 90% or 95% of the cases. So therefore, you have to learn the gender with every noun. And therefore, every decent Norwegian course, including my own course, will introduce the concept of grammatical gender early on, even though it's not a red grammar item. So what I invite you to do is to take a different perspective on yellow and green grammar items. When you study yellow or green grammar, take it as an illustration. Take it for you to see how the Norwegian language functions, but have in the back of your mind that if you get that wrong, it's not a big deal. Whereas the red grammar items are the ones that you should really focus on in order to get off the ground, to speak. And these are the things that you should learn so you can apply them correctly at all times, basically. But even more important than the grammar is actually the pronunciation when you speak Norwegian. And therefore, I'd like to invite you to check out my pronunciation videos here on this channel.